He slammed the hospital room door so hard the glass partition cracked. That was the first thing the nurses on floor 3 remembered about the man in the black coat. Not his face, not his name on the intake form, but the sound of that door. Like a gunshot. Like something final. Inside Trauma Bay 4, Claire Whitmore pressed her gloved hands against a stranger's chest and didn't look up. She had learned a long time ago not to flinch at loud noises in this building. Loud noises meant someone was still fighting. Quiet was what scared her. She didn't know yet that the man who'd just arrived, the one barking orders at her charge nurse, the one whose security team had sealed off the ambulance bay without asking permission, was the same man who had once kissed her in a parking lot on a Tuesday night and told her she was the only real thing in his life. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out. Ooh. If the person you once loved walked back into your life, broken, bleeding, and more dangerous than ever, what would you do? Would you save him? Or would you finally let go? This is a story about a woman who had no choice but to do both. If this is your kind of story, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because what happens between Claire and Vincent over the next 5 parts will stay with you long after it's over. Let's begin. The morning Claire Whitmore almost walked away from everything started the same way every morning started, badly. Her alarm went off at 5:15. She hit it without opening her eyes. Sophie had climbed into her bed sometime around 2 in the morning, which Claire only knew because the child's cold feet were pressed against her shins and her small elbow was wedged directly into Claire's ribs. 7 years old, and Sophie still slept like she was trying to escape from something. Claire lay still for a moment in the dark. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator ticking in the hallway and the distant groan of a garbage truck somewhere on Fullerton. She could feel the particular weight of a 12-hour shift coming, not dread exactly, more like the weight of armor you have to put on before you go back into battle. She didn't mind it. That was the honest truth, even if it would have sounded strange to admit out loud. She was good at her job, better than good. And the ER at Northwestern Memorial asked things of her she could actually deliver. Fast thinking, steady hands, the ability to make a decision in under 4 seconds and live with it. The rest of her life did not always cooperate with that same clarity. She eased Sophie's elbow off her ribs, tucked the blanket higher over her daughter's shoulder, and got up. By 6:30, she had coffee in a travel mug, Sophie's lunch half assembled on the counter, and her coat zipped against the particular cold that Chicago reserved for March, the month when winter refuses to admit it's over and makes everyone pay for the assumption. The walk to the L was 4 blocks. She made it in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had counted it so many times she didn't have to anymore. On the train, she stood holding the overhead bar and looking at nothing, the way people do when they're thinking about everything. She had a loan payment due on Friday. Sophie needed new shoes, had needed them for 3 weeks, and Claire kept forgetting when she was at the store and remembering when she was not. Her mother had called twice yesterday, which meant either she wanted to talk about something or she was about to want to talk about something. Claire had not yet determined which. These were the textures of her life, not extraordinary, not miserable, just hers. She had built them deliberately, the way you might build a wall, 1 stone at a time, not rushing, checking the level, making sure nothing was going to fall. She had gotten very good at not letting things fall. The first hour of her shift was a dislocated shoulder. A 4-year-old who had swallowed a small Lego piece, sitting quietly and looking unconcerned, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd been screaming, and a retired teacher named Gerald Marsh who had chest pain that turned out to be anxiety, and who apologized 5 times for wasting her time, even as she was connecting him to the monitor. "You're not wasting my time, Mr. Marsh," she said, not looking up from the lead she was placing. "This is exactly what I'm here for." The young lady at the front desk looked at me like I was bothering her. The young lady at the front desk looks at everyone like that. It's just her face. He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Claire felt the small satisfaction of that. The way a real laugh in a hospital room was always a kind of small victory. She moved on. That was the work. You moved on. By 9 o'clock, the bay was running at capacity, and the charge nurse, Diane Reyes, had that specific look on her face that meant something was coming. Diane had worked the ER for 19 years, and she had developed what she called her weather system, a set of physical tells that Claire had learned to read the way sailors read the sky. The set of Diane's jaw right now meant something incoming, something complicated. "What?" Claire asked, pulling off a pair of gloves. "MVA coming in. High speed on the I-94 interchange. 2 vehicles, head-on. 1 fatality at the scene." Diane paused. "The other one's alive, but it's bad. Blunt chest trauma, probable internal bleeding, possible TBI, ETA 4 minutes. Who's available?" "You and Ferris." "Get me a room." That was what she did. That was the language she thought in during those moments. Not words exactly, but sequences. Room. Blood type, IV access, imaging, sequence. She was already moving toward Trauma Bay 4 when she heard the ambulance pull in. The paramedics came through the doors the way they always did, fast, loud, calling out vitals as they moved, not waiting for anyone to ask. BP was low, pulse thready, GCS of 12, which meant he was conscious enough to be uncooperative, which a paramedic with a dark sense of humor once told her was the worst combination. Conscious enough to pull at the lines, not conscious enough to understand why they were there. Claire came alongside the gurney and started assessing without breaking stride. Blunt force trauma to the chest, left side. Possible rib fractures, She could see the way he was guarding it, even unconscious, the body doing what the mind could not. Laceration above the right eye, deep enough to need closing but not her immediate concern. Pulse ox at 91. That was her concern. "Get me a portable chest, somebody start a second large bore IV, and let's get a CBC and type and cross. Now." She didn't shout. She had never needed to shout. There was something in her voice, not authority exactly, more like certainty, that made people move. She reached for the patient's coat, pulling it back to get better access, and her hands found the fabric and found the lapel, and she registered in the background that it was expensive, heavy. The kind of coat that cost more than she made in a month, but that was background noise. She got her hands on his chest, beginning to assess, and felt him shift under her hands. He was fighting the gurney, not violently, more like a man trying to remember where he was and finding the answer insufficient. "Sir, I need you to be still. You're in the emergency room. You've been in an accident." And then he turned his head toward her voice. And the world did something it had no business doing in a trauma bay at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning in March. It stopped. The face was different. She registered that first. The clinical part of her brain doing its job, even as the rest of her went very, very still. Older. A scar near the jaw she didn't recognize. The hair shorter than she remembered. The eyes, she had not looked at those eyes in 8 years and had specifically, deliberately, on more than one occasion, trained herself not to remember what they looked like. She had not done a particularly good job. They were the same, dark, slightly too intense for a casual look. The kind of eyes that made you feel seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Looking at her now through the days of pain and adrenaline and whatever the paramedics had given him in the rig, and some part of him, some stubborn, inconvenient part, was recognizing her too. Vincent. The name came out before she could stop it, barely above a whisper. Not a name she said, not a name she let herself say. His mouth moved. Claire. His voice was wrecked, dry and strained and barely there, but unmistakably his. The particular low register of it. The way he said her name like it was 2 syllables that mattered. And then Dr. Ferris was beside her asking about the chest x-ray, and Diane was asking about the blood bank, and someone was wheeling in the portable ultrasound, and Claire Whitmore did the only thing she could do. She got back to work. She did not tell anyone. That was a decision she made in the space of approximately 3 seconds, while her hands were doing something competent and necessary, and her mind was doing something else entirely. She assessed the situation the way she assessed everything, quickly, without sentimentality, sorting the pieces into what mattered now and what would have to wait. What mattered now? Vincent DeLuca had a probable hemothorax. His oxygen was tanking, and if she did not focus, he was going to die on her table. What would have to wait? Everything else. The 8 years of silence. The explanation she had never received. The fact that somewhere across the city, in a second-grade classroom on the north side, a little girl with dark eyes and his exact jaw was currently doing a multiplication worksheet, completely unaware that her father was bleeding internally 12 floors below where her mother stood. Claire focused. The portable chest confirmed it, fluid in the left pleural space, compressing the lung. She called it out, got consent she didn't technically need in an emergency, and moved. Her hands knew what to do. That was the strange mercy of training. In the worst moments, the body just went, and the mind had to catch up later. The chest drain went in. The fluid came out. Vincent's oxygen climbed from 91 to 95 to 98. The monitor stopped doing the thing that made people nervous. Claire stepped back and stripped off her gloves. Ferris looked at her. Good call, fast. Let's get him to CT. I want to see what else we're dealing with. She walked out of Trauma Bay 4 into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and her hands, completely steady, she noted almost angrily, flat at her sides. She had saved him. That was what she did. She saved people. It didn't matter that this particular person had walked out of her life on a Thursday morning 8 years ago and left behind nothing. Not a note, not an explanation, not a phone call. Not one phone call. She had waited 3 weeks before she let herself understand that he was not coming back. She had spent the following 6 months in a particular kind of grief that she had no name for because he wasn't dead. He was simply gone. She had burned that grief down eventually, the way you burn down underbrush to let new things grow. She had grown Sophie. That was what she'd grown. And now he was in her hospital. She pushed off the wall and went to find the charge nurse. The security showed up 40 minutes later. That was what made it real, in a way that even seeing his face had not quite managed to accomplish. You could explain a face. Trauma sometimes did strange things to your perception, made you see people from your past in strangers. She had a colleague who once thought she saw her dead father in a patient and had to excuse herself from the room. The brain did what it needed to do. But you could not explain 4 men in dark coats materializing in the corridor outside the CT suite. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't show badges. They simply appeared, positioned at intervals down the hallway with a specific kind of stillness that meant they had been trained to stand still, that this was not waiting, this was work. Diane clocked them first. She appeared at Claire's elbow, voice low. You want to tell me what's happening? Our MVA patient, Claire said, watching them. Do those gentlemen belong to our MVA patient? I think so. Should I be calling security? They're not doing anything, Claire said, which was true. They were just standing there, watching the corridor with the patient efficiency of people whose job was to watch corridors. Let's see what they want. One of them approached. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, dark-haired, with a kind of contained energy that reminded Claire of a spring being held compressed. He had a phone in his hand, screen up, in a way that suggested he was waiting for permission to use it. Ms. Whitmore, he said. Not a question. That was the second thing that stopped her. He knew her name. That's me, she said, keeping her voice exactly the same. Mr. DeLuca is going to need to remain under observation tonight. We'd like to discuss arrangements for his care. He said it the way someone reads from a prepared statement, not robotically, but carefully, every word chosen. Mr. DeLuca is going to remain wherever his medical condition requires, Claire said. Those arrangements are between him, his treating physician, and the hospital, not his security detail. Something shifted slightly in the man's expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. Of course, he said. We simply want to ensure. I know what you want to ensure. She looked at him steadily. He's stable. He's in imaging. When he's in a room, you can post outside the door, which is standard practice. You don't enter without his permission, and you don't instruct my staff on anything. Are we clear? A pause. Then, yes, ma'am. She walked away before he could add anything else. Diane fell into step beside her. You want to tell me who that man actually is? Claire considered this for a full 3 seconds. A patient, she said finally. That's all he is right now. Diane looked at her sideways. She had worked with Claire for 4 years. She understood, in the way that people who work alongside each other through enough emergencies develop a kind of wordless fluency, that she was not going to get more than that right now. That this was, in some way, Claire was not going to articulate, something that sat outside the normal lines. She let it go. That was what made Diane good at her job. He was awake when they moved him to the observation room, not alert. He was running on whatever his body had left after the accident and whatever they'd given him for pain, and that was not very much. But his eyes were open and tracking, and when Claire came through the door with his chart, he looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than relief. Relief is what you feel when something you feared doesn't happen. This looked more like what you feel when something you thought could never happen, something you stopped letting yourself believe in, does. She kept her eyes on the chart. Your CT shows no internal bleeding, she said, and her voice was her work voice, precise, professional, with the particular warmth she extended to all her patients that was real but measured. The hemothorax is draining. We're going to keep you overnight for observation, and I want to repeat the imaging in 6 hours to confirm nothing's changed. You have 3 fractured ribs on the left side. They're going to hurt. A lot. There's nothing we do for fractured ribs except manage the pain and make sure you breathe deeply enough that you don't develop pneumonia. She paused. Do you have any questions about your care? He looked at her for a long moment. Are you seriously going to do this right now? He said. His voice was still rough, damaged by the intubation attempt in the field that hadn't ultimately been needed, or just by the accident itself, or by 8 years of whatever he'd been doing with them. She didn't know. She was not going to ask. I'm going to do my job, she said, which is what I was doing when they brought you in, and what I'll keep doing until you're discharged. She met his eyes then, briefly, deliberately, so he would understand she was making a choice and not avoiding. After that, you're not my patient anymore. Claire, Mr. DeLuca. She said it quietly but clearly. Not tonight. His jaw tightened. She saw him consider pushing and then decide not to. Not from deference, but from the same kind of tactical intelligence that was, she remembered with a discomfort she did not want to feel. One of the things she had once... She did not finish that thought. All right, he said. She wrote something in the chart she didn't need to write. Gave herself 3 seconds. Then she left. She did not go home at her usual time. She told herself it was the patient load, which was true. It had been a heavy morning. She told herself it was the paperwork, which was partially true. She stood at the nurse's station at 7:15 p.m., 45 minutes past the end of her shift, writing nothing, holding a pen she had been holding for about 6 minutes without using. Diane appeared and wordlessly set a cup of coffee on the counter beside her. You should go home, Diane said. I know. How's Sophie? At my mother's tonight. So there's nothing waiting for you. Claire set the pen down. I don't know what to do with this, she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out anyway, flat, honest, without any particular emotion attached, which was sometimes how the real things came out when you'd spent a day keeping them contained. Diane was quiet for a moment. Do you know him? I knew him a long time ago. Before everything. That covered it as well as anything else would. Diane picked up the empty coffee cup from the counter. Not Claire's, someone else's left there, and turned it in her hands the way people do when they're thinking about what not to say. You don't have to figure it out tonight, she said finally. I know. Go home. Claire went home. She sat on her couch in the dark, coat still on, and looked at the wall for a while. Sophie's drawings were there, taped up in an overlapping cascade of crayon and marker, a record of the last 2 years of a child's artistic output, mostly featuring what appeared to be a large orange dog that Sophie insisted was a dinosaur and that Claire had stopped arguing about. There was one in the corner, done in purple, that was unmistakably a family portrait, a tall woman, a small girl, a gap where something else might have gone. Sophie had drawn that gap deliberately. Claire had noticed. She had not asked about it. She pulled out her phone and looked at it for a while without doing anything. Then she put it face down on the cushion and sat in the dark with a 7-year-old's drawing of an empty space and the particular sound of a door slamming in her chest that had been there, she realized. since 9:14 that morning. It sounded like something she had locked away, trying very hard to open. She went back the next morning. She told herself it was because she was his attending physician, and that was what attending physicians did. They went back. They checked the drain output and the repeat imaging and the pain management, and they made decisions based on data, not on the fact that they had once spent 3 weeks waiting for a phone call that never came. She had her coffee. She had her chart. She had her work voice ready, like a coat she'd been wearing so long she sometimes forgot it wasn't her actual skin. What she had not prepared for was walking into room 412 and finding Vincent DeLuca sitting up in bed, drain still in, monitor leads still attached, looking out the window at the gray Chicago morning with an expression she recognized against her will. She had seen that face before. Not on him, on Sophie. When Sophie was trying to work something out that she didn't have words for yet. That particular stillness that looked like calm but was actually the opposite of calm. He heard her come in and turned. She moved directly to the monitor without looking at him, checked the numbers, made a note. Output from the drain had slowed overnight. That was what she needed to know. That was all she needed. "That's good," she said. "Drainage is down. We'll repeat the chest film at noon, and if it looks clean, we can pull the drain this afternoon." "Okay," he said. She wrote in the chart. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you look tired." She looked up from the chart. It was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake before she did it, but she did it anyway. And there he was, watching her with that direct, inconvenient attention that had always made her feel simultaneously seen and cornered, like being in a spotlight you'd walked into yourself. "Don't do that," she said. "What?" "That thing where you observe me and then report your findings out loud, like it's a kindness." Something crossed his face. It might have been a smile if it hadn't been wrapped in something heavier. "Fair enough," he said. She went back to the chart. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. 6 years. "You always wanted to go to Northwestern. You talked about it once. I remember thinking—" He stopped. "Mr. DeLuca." "Vincent, I need you to understand something." She set the chart down on the bedside table and looked at him directly because she had decided last night, sitting on her couch in her coat in the dark, that the only way through this was direct. You treated it like a wound. You didn't circle it. You went straight at it and you cleaned it and you let it hurt and then you moved on. You are my patient. For the next 24 to 48 hours, depending on how your imaging looks, I am responsible for your care. After that, you are discharged, and you are not my patient anymore. What I need from you right now is cooperation with your treatment. That is the only thing I need from you." He listened to all of it, then he said, "She has your eyes." The room did something. The air in it shifted. She felt it physically, in her chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with clinical anxiety and everything to do with the particular terror of a thing you have been carrying alone suddenly being visible to someone else. "I saw the photo," he said quietly. "On your badge. There's a photo on the back of your hospital ID badge. A little girl, dark hair." Claire's hand was on her badge before she could stop it, a reflex covering it, the way you'd cover something exposed. She had put that photo there 2 years ago. Sophie at 5, grinning, missing a tooth, holding up a drawing of the orange dinosaur. She looked at that photo sometimes between patients when she needed a reason to keep moving. "A lot of people have children," she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "How old is she?" "That's not Claire." He said her name differently this time, not the way he'd said it the day before, when it was recognition, almost involuntary. This was deliberate. This was a man who had done many difficult things in his life and was about to do one more. "How old is she?" She looked at him. He looked back. 8 years of silence between them, and this was what broke it open. A photo on the back of a hospital badge, a dark-haired little girl with a missing tooth, and her mother's eyes and her father's exact jaw. "I have other patients," Claire said. She picked up the chart and left. Diane was waiting in the corridor. Not obviously waiting, she was doing something with a medication cart, something that could plausibly have been the thing she was actually doing. But she looked up too quickly when Claire came out. "Don't," Claire said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Diane pushed the cart a few inches to the left. The man in 412 had his lawyer on the phone at 6 this morning. I heard it through the door when I went to check his vitals. He wasn't being quiet about it. Claire absorbed this. What kind of lawyer? The kind that talks about liability and discretion in the same sentence. He's allowed to call his lawyer. He's also allowed to call whoever it was he called after that, Diane said. But I thought you should know that about 20 minutes ago, a woman in a very expensive coat arrived at the front desk asking for the attending physician on the DeLuca case. Claire stopped walking. I told her the attending wasn't available, Diane said. She's been sitting in the family waiting area since then. She has not touched the magazines. What does she look like? Like someone who has delivered bad news before and is prepared to do it again. What? The woman's name was Catherine Voss. She gave it without being asked, the way people give their name when they want you to know they expect it to mean something. She was in her mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal coat that was exactly as expensive as Diane had suggested. She had a leather folder in her lap that she did not open. Claire sat across from her in the family waiting area, which smelled of old coffee and the specific grief of people waiting for news, and said nothing because she had found over the years that saying nothing first was usually more informative than speaking. Catherine Voss looked at her with frank, assessing eyes. You're the attending physician. I am. You also knew Vincent, before. Claire kept her face neutral. I'm going to need to understand who you are and what your connection to my patient is before this conversation continues. I've been Vincent's attorney for 11 years, Catherine said. I am also, in the way that sometimes happens when you spend 11 years managing someone's life alongside them. Something like a friend, though that's not a word he would use. He doesn't use that word easily. She paused. He asked me to come. He asked you to come speak to me. He asked me to come make sure you didn't disappear. The directness of it landed without apology. Those were his words. He said, and I'm quoting, "She's going to find a reason to transfer me to another doctor before I can say what I need to say. Don't let her do that." Something tight and hot moved through Claire's chest. He doesn't get to decide who his physician is. No, Catherine agreed. He doesn't. I told him that. She looked at Claire with something that was not quite sympathy, more like the recognition of one person who has been managing an impossible situation for years to another. But he also asked me to tell you something. He said you wouldn't believe it coming from him directly. He said you'd have your defenses up before he finished the sentence. What did he ask you to tell me? Catherine Voss folded her hands over the leather folder. That he knew about Sophie before the accident. The waiting room did not change. The overhead lights continued their low, institutional hum. Somewhere down the corridor a child was crying, but not in distress, just the ordinary crying of a child who wanted something. All of it continued exactly as before. Claire said, "That's not possible." "He's been watching over you for 3 years," Catherine said. Not gently, not unkindly, but without softening it. The way you deliver information to someone who needs information, not comfort. He found out by accident. Someone who knew you both from before recognized you at a street fair. He saw a photo. He didn't approach you. He instructed that you not be approached. But he... Claire. She stopped, recalibrated. He knew. He knew. Claire heard her own voice from somewhere outside herself. Very quiet. Very controlled. He knew he had a daughter, and he believed it was safer, for both of you, for Sophie. Catherine's voice was careful now. The situation he was managing, he said, I can't give you details, you don't have clearance for details, but the kind of danger that existed around him at that time was not, don't! Claire's voice had changed. It was still quiet. It was not controlled anymore. Don't sit here in my hospital and tell me about danger. I raised her alone. I raised her completely alone, and he knew, and he didn't... She stopped, pressed her lips together. One breath. He chose. Yes, Catherine said. He did. He chose to watch from a distance and decide what was safe for me and my daughter without ever asking me what I wanted. Yes. And now he's in my hospital, and he wants... What? He wants me to walk back in there and have a conversation? He wants me to... She stopped again. The control she'd been holding all morning was doing something she didn't like. It was cracking, and not cleanly, the way glass sometimes cracks before it breaks. In small, spreading lines, not yet visible from the outside, but happening. What does he actually want, Ms. Voss? Catherine was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, less the attorney, and more the woman who had spent 11 years watching someone manage a life that was always one decision away from catastrophe. He wants to tell you himself, that's all he said. He just wants the chance to tell you himself. She did not go back to room 412. She went to the supply room on the third floor, which was a room nobody went to without a reason, and stood between the shelving units in the cold fluorescent light and did something she had not done in front of another person in approximately 4 years. She put her back against the metal shelf and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and just breathed, not crying. She was not crying. She was doing the thing that came before crying, the thing where your body is trying to decide whether to or not, and you have about a 30-second window to intervene. She intervened. 3 breaths, hard and deliberate, the way she breathed through codes when she needed her hands to stop shaking. He had known. He had known about Sophie for 3 years. Sophie was 7, which meant he had found out when Sophie was 4. When Sophie had just started preschool and was going through a phase of screaming at bedtime, and Claire had been surviving on 5 hours of sleep and working extra shifts to cover a hot water heater that had stopped working in December. He had known during all of that. He had been somewhere in this city, knowing, and he had sent no word and asked nothing and just watched. And she did not know whether that was the cruelest thing she had ever heard or whether she understood it, and the fact that she wasn't sure which it was frightened her more than anything else. She pushed off the shelf, checked her face in the dark reflection of the door's small window. Not perfect, nothing was going to be perfect today, and went back to work. What? The noon imaging came back clean. She pulled the drain herself, because she was still his physician, and she was not going to stop doing her job because her personal life had elected to implode in a controlled manner. Vincent said nothing while she worked. She appreciated that with a ferocity that surprised her. When she taped the site, her hands brushed his ribs, the left side, where the fractures were, where even her light clinical touch made his breath catch and his jaw go tight. And she said automatically, "Sorry," and he said, "Don't be." And for a moment they were just 2 people in a room, and it was almost bearable. Then she straightened, and he said without preamble, "I was 19 when my father brought me into the business. I didn't choose it. I want you to know that. I know it doesn't change anything." She picked up the removed drain components and put them in the disposal. "You don't need to tell me this." "I do. I need you to—" He stopped. She heard him rearrange something in his voice, the way people do when they're about to say something they've said many times in their head and never out loud. "I was 26 when I met you. I was trying to get out. I had been trying to get out for 2 years, and I thought, I genuinely believed I was close. And then my father was killed, and everything I had been building toward disappeared overnight." She stood with her back to him, facing the disposal unit. "The people who killed him came after everyone connected to the family, friends, associates, people who'd never been involved in anything. It didn't matter. You weren't safe just because you were innocent. I knew if they found out about you—" He stopped again. "I had 2 choices. Take you with me into something you had no idea you'd agreed to, or disappear and let you think whatever you thought about me. I thought you didn't love me enough to stay," she said. She had not planned to say that. It came out of some chamber she'd thought she'd welded shut. "I know," he said. "That's what I thought for 8 years." "I know, Claire." She turned around. He was looking at her with those eyes that had no business still doing what they did to her, and he looked like what he was, a man with 3 broken ribs and a drain site and 8 years of choices sitting on him like weight, and she felt the crack in her control spread just slightly further. "You should have told me," she said. "You should have told me the truth and let me decide." "Yes." "You took that from me." "Yes." His voice was stripped down, no argument in it, no defense, just the acknowledgement, which was somehow worse than if he'd argued, because there was nothing to push back against. "I did. I took that from you, and I have been—" He looked at his hands for a moment. His hands were not entirely steady. There is not a right word for what 8 years of that does to you. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm not asking you for anything right now. Ms. Voss told me you've known about Sophie for 3 years. The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind where someone is deciding not to lie, which takes more time than you'd think. Yes, he said. 3 years. Yes. And you decided for me again. She heard her voice go flat. Not cold exactly, flat. The way things go flat when the emotion is too large and the only way to hold it is to press it down until it doesn't have a shape anymore. You decided what was safe for her without asking me. The organization I was running, Claire, you don't understand what... I understand that my daughter is 7 years old, and she has asked me 4 times why she doesn't have a dad. The words landed in the room and stayed there. 4 times. The first time she was 4 and she asked it like it was a math problem, like there was just a piece of information she was missing that would make everything make sense. The last time was 6 months ago. She stopped. She was not going to let her voice do anything. She was not. She stopped asking after that. She just stopped. He didn't speak. She stopped asking, Claire said again, because she decided the answer was that he was gone and wasn't coming back, and that was something she was going to have to learn to live with. She looked at him. She's 7, and she's already decided to live with it. The monitor beeped twice into the silence. Routine. Meaningless. Vincent DeLuca, the man Catherine Voss had spent 11 years describing in legal documents as a person of significant resources and broader influence, the man whose name made other men in this city drop their voices when they said it, had the look of someone who has just understood the actual cost of something they thought they had already paid for. His hands were flat on the blanket. His jaw was working. He wasn't speaking because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and he knew it. I need you to be honest with me, Claire said. Her voice had come back to something steadier. Not her work voice, something underneath it, older, more tired. Are you still in it? He didn't pretend not to understand the question. Yes. Is that going to change? I am... He stopped, started again. I am working toward a way out. It is not simple. It is not fast. But yes, that is what I am working toward. How long? I don't know. Are you in danger right now? Not from the accident, from your world. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for. There are always people who would use people I care about to get to me, he said carefully. That has always been true. It is why I stayed away. And now you're in my hospital. And now I'm in your hospital. The implication of it settled over both of them slowly, like something cold. His people knew where he was, which meant anyone watching his people knew where he was, which meant that whatever separation he had carefully maintained between his world and her life had just been compressed into a single building, a single floor, a room number that was in the hospital's system. Claire looked at the door, then back at him. You need to be discharged, she said. Not this afternoon, now. My imaging is clean enough. I'll note it as patient-directed discharge, get you the follow-up instructions, and you need to be out of this building in the next 2 hours. She was already moving to the door. Because if what you're telling me is true, every hour you're here is an hour someone who wants to use people you care about knows exactly where to find. She stopped. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She turned back. She looked at him. This man, this wreck of a man with his broken ribs and his broken explanations and 8 years of choices, neither of them could take back. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific terror of caring what happened to someone you had no right to still care about. I have a daughter, she said, and she doesn't know you exist. I know. And now you're here, and she's going to find out. Whether I tell her or she figures it out herself or the world decides for me the way you did. She's going to find out. I know, he said again. So I need you to understand something, Vincent. Whatever you want, whatever you're working toward, whatever your plan is, she comes first. Not your organization, not your timeline, not whatever you think is safest. Her voice was not shaking. She needed it not to shake, and it cooperated. Her, First, always, or I will make sure you never get within 20 feet of her. Do you understand me?" He looked at her with those impossible eyes and he said, "Yes." One word, no caveat, no negotiation. She believed him. She hated that she believed him. She believed him anyway. "I'll start the discharge paperwork," she said, and her hand was on the door handle when his voice stopped her one more time. "Claire." She didn't turn around. "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything," he said, "but I'm asking. Don't decide yet about what happens after this. Don't decide while you're still this angry." She stood at the door with her hand on the handle and the corridor noise coming through the gap and the weight of 7 years of a raised alone daughter and 4 unanswered questions pressing on her from the other side. "You've got 2 hours," she said. She walked out. And somewhere in the building, in the direction of the family waiting area, through 3 corridors and a set of double doors, Catherine Voss was already on the phone, and the men in dark coats in the hallway were already moving, and something that had been still for 8 years was no longer still. And Claire Whitmore understood with the clarity of someone who has just stepped off a ledge that there was no version of the next 48 hours that looked anything like the life she had built so carefully, one stone at a time, making sure nothing was going to fall. Something was going to fall. The only question left was what she was going to do when it did. The discharge paperwork took 40 minutes. Claire moved through it the way she moved through everything that morning, mechanically, efficiently, with the particular focus of someone who has decided that motion is safer than stillness. She pulled the forms, documented the imaging results, wrote the follow-up instructions in the clear block print she used when she wanted no ambiguity about what a patient needed to do next. Rest. No heavy lifting. Follow up with a thoracic specialist in 7 days. Return immediately if breathing became difficult or pain escalated beyond manageable. She did not write, "Stay away from my daughter." She did not write, "I spent last night looking at a purple crayon drawing of an empty space and understanding for the first time that my child has been grieving something she never had." She handed the paperwork to the floor nurse and said Vincent DeLuca in room 412 was being discharged patient-directed and to process it through. Then she went to check on a 63-year-old woman in room 408 who had come in with a possible stroke and turned out to have a UTI, which happened more often than people realized, and which had made the woman cry with relief in a way that made Claire want to cry too, though she didn't. She was in the middle of explaining the prescription when her pager went off. She glanced at it. The number was the nursing station on 4. She finished her sentence. "Finish the antibiotics, all of them, even when you feel better, especially when you feel better," and went to find out what was happening. Diane met her in the corridor. Her face was doing the thing it did when the weather had already turned and there was no point forecasting anymore. "He's gone," Diane said. "I know, I discharged him." "His room is gone," Diane said. "I mean, the men who were in the hallway, all of them. The woman in the waiting area. Gone." She paused. "There's also a man downstairs asking for you at the front desk. Not the same men, different. He said his name is Marco Reyes and that Vincent DeLuca sent him." Claire looked at her. "He said it wasn't urgent," Diane added, which clearly meant it was. Marco Reyes was younger than the men from the hallway, mid-20s, with the lean build of someone who moved for a living and a face that had learned early to express nothing in particular. He was standing near the revolving doors in the main lobby, not sitting, which told her something. People who sit in lobbies are waiting. People who stand near exits are ready to move. He had an envelope in his hand. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. "I know who you are," she said. She didn't, not really, but she'd found that starting a conversation with someone from Vincent's world by admitting ignorance was structurally unwise. "What do you want?" "Mr. DeLuca asked me to give you this." He held out the envelope. Standard white, unsealed, her name on the front in handwriting she did not recognize, that not Vincent's. Someone else had addressed it. "He also asked me to tell you that starting this afternoon, there will be 2 people watching the building where your daughter attends school. They won't approach her. They won't interact with her in any way. They're there as a precaution." Claire took the envelope. She did not open it. "What kind of precaution?" Something shifted in Marco's face, just slightly, like a weight being redistributed. "There was an incident last night. at a location connected to Mr. DeLuca. He didn't want to tell you in the hospital because he didn't want you to... Marco stopped, found a different word. He wanted you to make the decision about your daughter before you had other information pushing you one way or the other. What incident? It would be better if you read the letter first. What incident, Mr. Reyes? He looked at the revolving doors, back at her. A rival organization has been monitoring Mr. DeLuca's movements for approximately 6 weeks. There was a confrontation last night between members of that organization and Mr. DeLuca's associates. During the confrontation, a photograph was recovered. He paused. A photograph of your daughter, at her school, taken from outside the fence. The lobby continued around them. A man in a blue coat walked past, talking on his phone. An orderly pushed an empty wheelchair toward the elevators. Everything moved at its ordinary pace. Claire said, "When was it taken?" 3 days ago. 3 days. The number sat in her mouth like something with no taste. 3 days ago, someone photographed my daughter at her school, and you're telling me now. Mr. DeLuca only learned about the photograph last night, Marco said carefully, when his people recovered it. He was in your hospital at the time. He asked me to come to you this morning rather than tell you while he was in your care, because he wanted you to be somewhere you felt... Stop managing how you tell me this, Claire said. Her voice was very quiet. She had learned a long time ago that the quieter her voice got, the more important it was to pay attention to it. Tell me what I need to know. Marco straightened slightly. The organization is called the Sartori Group. They operate primarily in narcotics distribution and have been in a territorial conflict with the DeLuca family for approximately 14 months. They became aware of your existence and Sophie's approximately 3 weeks ago. We believe the accident that brought Mr. DeLuca into your hospital was not an accident. The lobby went very still around her, or she went very still inside it. She couldn't determine which. The collision on the I-94, she said, was deliberate. The other vehicle accelerated into his. The driver survived and was detained by Mr. DeLuca's people last night. He confirmed the Sartori Group arranged it. Marco held her gaze. He had the decency not to look away. They wanted him injured, compromised. They wanted him somewhere public and immobile where they could observe his connections. They wanted to see who came to him, Claire said. Yes. They knew he'd be brought to this hospital. They knew the accident would route the ambulance here, yes. She understood then completely what she was being told. They had used the hospital, used her building, her trauma bay, her hands, to confirm something they already suspected. That this woman, this nurse, was someone Vincent DeLuca would not be indifferent to waking up and seeing. They had watched his face when he saw her, or someone had, and whatever they'd seen had confirmed what the photograph of a 7-year-old at a school fence already suggested. They didn't use the accident to hurt him, she said, not primarily. They used it to find out if Sophie was really his. Marco said nothing, which was its own answer. She read the letter in the supply room on the 3rd floor. The same supply room. She was developing, she thought distantly, a relationship with this room. Vincent's handwriting, it was his, on the letter itself, different from the envelope, was smaller than she remembered, more controlled. The letter was not long. He did not apologize. She noticed that first. He did not open with apology or explanation. He opened with a fact. The people who want to use Sophie against me are aware of her. I cannot change that. I can only change what happens next. Then 3 sentences that she read twice. I have spent 3 years telling myself that watching from a distance was enough, that knowing she was safe was sufficient. I was wrong. Safe is not a distance you can maintain from the outside. Safe is something you build together or it doesn't hold. Then, I am asking you for 2 weeks, not to be forgiven, not to pretend the last 8 years were anything other than what they were. 2 weeks for you to decide. With full information, with full knowledge of what my world is and what I am trying to make it become, whether you want me anywhere near Sophie's life. If you say no, I will honor that. I will ensure your safety through channels that don't require my presence. You will never hear from me again. Then, at the bottom, I know what I cost you. I know what those 4 questions cost her. I know I don't get those years back. I'm not asking for them. I'm asking for whatever comes after this. No sign-off. Just his name. She folded the letter, put it in her scrub's pocket, stood in the cold fluorescent light for approximately 90 seconds. Then she called her mother. Bess. Her mother's name was Patricia, and she had the particular gift, common in women who had survived difficult lives with their warmth intact, of knowing when not to ask questions. Claire told her that Sophie needed to stay with her for a few days. And Patricia said, of course. And then Claire said it might be complicated, and Patricia said, when has it ever been otherwise? And then Claire said, I'll explain later, and Patricia said, take your time, which was the most useful thing anyone said to her that entire day. Sophie was at school. She would not be alarmed by going to Grandma's. Patricia's apartment had better snacks and a cat named Gerald, who Sophie considered a personal friend. Claire texted the school to note the change in afternoon pickup and then stood in the parking structure of the hospital at 2:15 in the afternoon looking at her phone and doing something she had not done in a very long time. She Googled Vincent DeLuca. She was not sure why she hadn't done it before. Maybe because before the accident, his name was not something she let herself think directly, and you can't search for something you're actively not thinking. Maybe because some part of her had understood that knowledge would require response, and she had spent 8 years not responding. The results were what she expected and worse than she'd expected simultaneously. There were no direct accusations. He was careful. He or whoever managed his public profile was careful. There were business articles, real estate filings, a charitable foundation bearing his family's name. There was a brief mention in a Tribune piece from 4 years ago about organized crime in Chicago, his name in a list, nothing more. There was a federal court document, heavily redacted, from 6 years ago in which he was named as a person of interest and subsequently cleared. There was also, buried on the 3rd page of results, a 2-year-old local blog post, not journalism exactly, more like the kind of thing someone writes when they know something and can't prove it, that listed the names of 4 people who had died in the previous decade during what the blog post called adjacently to DeLuca interests: a fire that destroyed a warehouse, a car accident on the west side, 2 disappearances that had never been resolved. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and drove to her mother's apartment. Bus. Sophie was already there when she arrived, sitting at Patricia's kitchen table doing homework with the focused, slightly resentful energy of a child who knows she's supposed to do it and hasn't yet decided to pretend otherwise. The cat Gerald was on the chair beside her. "Mom," Sophie said without looking up, "Gerald keeps sitting on my math." "That's between you and Gerald," Claire said. She kissed the top of Sophie's head, held it a second longer than usual. Sophie tolerated this with the grace of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by it, which was a grace period Claire was aware of and tried not to waste. Patricia appeared from the hallway with the measured expression of a woman who had things to say and was choosing the right moment. She made tea she didn't ask if Claire wanted, and set it on the table and sat down across from her daughter with the specific posture of someone who has been waiting. "Sophie," Claire said, "can you take your homework to Grandma's room for a little while?" "Take Gerald." Sophie looked at her. Children were perceptive in ways adults had mostly learned to suppress. She looked at Claire's face, then at Patricia's, and did the calculation. "Is something bad happening?" she asked. "Something is changing," Claire said. "I'll explain it when I understand it better. Right now I need 10 minutes. Sophie considered this. "Okay," she said finally, with the solemnity of a person granting a significant concession. She gathered her worksheets and her pencil case and disappeared down the hallway, with Gerald padding behind her. Patricia watched her go, then turned back to Claire. "Tell me," she said. So Claire told her. Not everything. Not the letter, not the specific threat, not the photograph taken through a school fence. She told her the shape of it. Vincent DeLuca was back. He was Sophie's father. He had known about Sophie and said nothing. There were people connected to his world who now knew Sophie existed. She did not yet know what came next. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was the most loving thing she could have done. When Claire finished, Patricia wrapped both her hands around her tea mug and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "Are you afraid?" Claire thought about the photograph taken through a fence. A 7-year-old with dark hair and a missing tooth grin. Taken 3 days ago, before any of this, while Sophie was presumably at recess or in the lunch line or just being a child in the ordinary way of children. "Yes," she said. Of him or of them? She had not separated the two yet. She did it now, carefully, the way you sort the contents of something spilled, putting like with like, seeing what you actually have. Vincent had kept his distance and watched, which was its own kind of wrong, but it was a wrong that had been trying, in its broken and unilateral way, to be protective. The Sartori group had taken a photograph of her daughter at school. That was not trying to protect anyone. That was the identification of a target. "Them," she said. "Right now, them." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then whatever you decide about him, about Vincent, keep those separate." "They're not separate. He's why they exist." "Yes," Patricia said. "But the decision about him and the decision about her safety, those are different decisions. Don't let them collapse into each other." It was the clearest thing anyone had said to her in 2 days. She looked at her mother with the periodic, blunt gratitude she had for the woman. Not sentimental, just real. Patricia had raised Claire mostly alone too, after Claire's father left when she was 11, and she had done it without making it a story about sacrifice or hardship. She had just done it, the way you do things that need doing. "Thank you," Claire said. "Drink the tea," Patricia said, "and call him back." She called the number Marco had written on the outside of the envelope. He answered on the second ring. "I need to see him," she said. "Tonight. Not at the hospital. Somewhere I choose." A pause. "I'll need to confirm with Mr. DeLuca. I'm not asking his permission," Claire said. "I'm telling you where I'll be and he can decide if he comes. Piccolo's on Armitage, 8 o'clock. She had chosen it deliberately. A restaurant she'd been to enough times that she knew the layout, the exits, the table in the back corner that had sightlines to the door. She had not known, before today, that this was information she'd ever need. Now it was the first thing she thought about. He comes alone. No coats in the hallway. Another pause. "I understand." She hung up. Isha. She arrived at 7:40. Sat with her back to the wall and ordered water and looked at the door and thought about the blog post with the 4 names and thought about the letter that said, "Safe is not a distance you can maintain from the outside," and thought about Sophie asking 4 times why she didn't have a dad and then stopping because she'd decided the answer was gone and wasn't coming back. Vincent arrived at 7:58. He was walking carefully. 3 fractured ribs would do that. And he had traded the hospital gown for dark clothes that fit him the way expensive clothes fit people who were used to wearing them. He looked older than she had let herself notice in the hospital. Not badly older, just marked. The way years mark people who have been doing difficult things in them. He saw her and came directly to the table without stopping to survey the room, which surprised her because she had assumed he was the kind of man who always surveyed a room. He pulled the chair out and sat down across from her and said nothing. She had prepared things to say. She had organized them on the drive over, in the particular way she organized things that mattered, sequentially, clearly, each point leading logically to the next. She said none of them. What she said was, "Who were the 4 people?" He looked at her steadily. "What 4 people?" "The blog post, the warehouse fire, the car accident, the 2 who disappeared." Something moved through his face. She watched it carefully. It was not surprise. He had expected this, or something like it. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked a question they have prepared for and still hoped would not come. "One of them was a threat to my organization that I addressed," he said. 2 of them were consequences of decisions made by people I trusted who I no longer trust. The 4th was..." He stopped, looked at the table, looked back up. "The 4th was a man who was going to hurt someone I couldn't get to in time. He did not survive the attempt." "Did you kill him?" "No." "Did you order it?" A pause. "Yes." She sat with that. She had not expected the directness of it. She had expected evasion, some version of it's complicated, or you don't understand how this works. He had not given her evasion. He had given her the truth in the flat, stripped-down way of someone who has decided that honesty, even when it costs him, is the only currency he has left. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me the same way, she said. Not the legal answer, not the careful answer, the true one. All right. Is Sophie in danger right now, tonight? There are 2 people outside this restaurant, he said. There are 2 people outside your mother's apartment. Sophie is not in danger tonight. Is she in danger as long as you're in her life? He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet, not the evasive kind. There is danger connected to my world, he said. That danger existed before Sophie and will exist regardless of my choices. The question is whether she is more protected with me present and actively managing it, or more exposed because of my proximity. He looked at her. I have to believe, that present and active is safer than distant and passive. Because distant and passive is what I have been doing for 3 years, and 3 weeks ago someone took a photograph of her at school. They knew about her before the accident. Yes. So your strategy of watching from a distance was already compromised. Yes, he said. It was. She looked at him across the table. The restaurant moved around them, quiet midweek noise, the clink of glasses, a couple at a nearby table laughing about something. Ordinary life continuing its ordinary business. I read your letter, she said. I know. You said 2 weeks. I did. I want to know what 2 weeks looks like, specifically. She put her hands flat on the table. Not aggressive, grounding. I want to know what you're asking for in those 2 weeks. What you expect. What you want from her. What you want from me. He leaned forward slightly. His ribs made him wince. Just barely, quickly suppressed. I want to meet her, he said. Once. In a place you choose. In a way you control. For as long or as short as you decide. I don't get to have opinions about the conditions. That's not a negotiation. I meet her once, you see how she responds, and then you decide everything that happens after. If she's frightened of me or doesn't want to see me again, I accept that. And if she does want to see you again, then we figure that out together, he said. You and I. Not me deciding what's best and telling you about it from a distance. Together. She studied him. She had spent 8 years building very good instincts. The single mother instincts, the ER nurse instincts, the I have no margin for error here instincts. She ran all of them over what he had just said. There's something you're not telling me, she said. His jaw tightened slightly. Vincent. She said his name the way she said difficult things, directly, without decoration. What else? He put his hands on the table. His hands were steady, she noticed, in the same involuntary way she'd noticed her own hands were steady in the trauma bay. Steadiness as trained response. The Sartori group made contact this afternoon, he said, through intermediaries. They're not interested in another territorial dispute. They want to end the DeLuca organization entirely, and they have indicated that if I don't cede certain operations by the end of the month, he paused. They've indicated they know where Sophie goes to school. They've indicated they know her schedule. The restaurant noise continued. The couple nearby laughed again. Claire felt something happen inside her that was not fear. She had already passed through fear today and come out the other side into something harder and colder and more functional. It was the feeling of a decision crystallizing, of something liquid becoming solid, of a woman who had spent 7 years making sure nothing fell, understanding that something was about to fall, and that the only question left was whether she controlled the direction. They threatened her, she said. Yes. Explicitly. Explicitly. She looked at him. He looked back. His face was doing what it had been doing since the moment she'd walked into room 412 the previous morning, trying to carry more than it was equipped to carry, and not asking her to help, and failing, and not asking her to help with that either. She thought about Patricia's voice. Keep those decisions separate. She thought about Sophie at the kitchen table with Gerald on her math, and the purple crayon drawing with the gap in it. She thought about 4 questions asked and then stopped, because some things a child will grieve quietly and alone rather than keep asking for what isn't coming. I'm going to need you to tell me everything, she said. Not the version you think I can handle. Everything. Because starting right now, whatever decisions get made about my daughter's life. She held his gaze and did not look away. I make them. Not you. Not your lawyer. Not your security team. Me. Are we clear? He did not answer immediately. She watched him process it. The man who had controlled a criminal empire, who had made decisions that had ended lives, sitting across a restaurant table from a woman in scrubs who was rearranging the terms of his existence. Yes, he said finally, we're clear. Good. She picked up her water glass. Her hands were still steady. Then start talking. He started talking, and 20 minutes into what he was telling her, the structure of the Sartori threat, the leverage they held, the specific mechanism by which they intended to dismantle what Vincent had spent his adult life building, something landed on the table between them that neither of them had known was coming. A name. A connection. Something that reached back not to Vincent's world but to hers, and not to 8 years ago but to something older than that. A name that explained, with the specific nausea of a thing clicking into place wrong, why the Sartori group had been watching her specifically. Not just because of Sophie, not just because of Vincent, because of her mother. Because of something Patricia Whitmore had done 30 years ago that she had never told her daughter, in a city that turned out to be much smaller than anyone had believed, and in a world where the past did not stay buried just because you had stopped visiting the grave. Claire set down the water glass. She looked at the man across the table, and for the first time since Vincent DeLuca had turned his head toward her voice in Trauma Bay 4, she understood that she had not been a bystander caught in the edge of someone else's danger. She had been a thread in this for longer than she had ever been alive to know. Claire sat very still. The restaurant noise had not changed. The couple nearby had moved on to dessert. A server refilled someone's wine glass 3 tables over. All of it continued with the indifference of a world that did not know it was supposed to stop. Say that name again, she said. Vincent looked at her face and understood, in the way of someone who has spent his life reading rooms, that something had just shifted that he had not anticipated. Whitmore, he said carefully. Patricia Whitmore, your mother. The Sartori Group has documentation linking her to a financial arrangement made in 1993 with a man named Caruso. He was Sal Sartori's father, the founder of the organization. The arrangement involved... Stop. Claire's voice was flat. She needed him to stop talking for exactly 10 seconds while she did something internal and necessary. She pressed one hand flat on the table and looked at it. The hand was steady. She was going to be grateful for that, and then she was going to move. My mother was 24 in 1993. Yes. She was working at a bank on the south side, a small commercial bank. She was a teller. Yes. And she had a connection to Caruso. Vincent's voice was careful in the way of someone disarming something. She processed a series of wire transfers over about 18 months. She may not have known what they were. The documentation doesn't indicate she knew. But she signed the intake forms. Her signature is on the records. He paused. Sal Sartori's son has been holding those records for years. As an instrument. A resource. He uses them when he needs access, compliance, when he needs someone to have a reason to cooperate. He was going to use them against her, Claire said. He was going to use them against you, through her. Vincent's jaw was tight. They don't care about your mother. She's leverage. What they want is for you to pressure me. They believe, they have apparently decided, that the fastest way to make me comply with their terms is through you, and the fastest way to guarantee your compliance is to threaten what happens to your mother if you don't deliver. Claire looked up from her hand. What are their terms? They want me to transfer control of 3 distribution territories on the north side and to provide documentation that implicates 2 of my remaining lieutenants in federal offenses that would put both of them away for 20 years. And then they absorb my operation, and I become irrelevant, or I become a liability that needs to be managed. He said it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. Those are the 2 options they're offering. When do they need an answer? 72 hours from this afternoon. She did the math without meaning to. 48 of those hours had already happened during the discharge paperwork, the drive to her mother's apartment, the tea she hadn't drunk. No, That was wrong. She recalculated. The contact had been this afternoon. She looked at her phone on the table. It was 9:17 p.m. She had 69 hours. She picked up her water glass again, put it down without drinking. Does my mother know any of this? She asked. No. Are you sure? I'm sure. She thought about Patricia's kitchen, the cat on the math homework, her mother's hands around the tea mug. A woman who had never told her daughter about a bank job in 1993 and some wire transfers she probably hadn't understood, and a signature she'd added to forms that turned out to matter 30 years later in ways no 24-year-old teller could have imagined. I have to tell her, Claire said. Yes. Tonight. Yes. I think that's right. She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with the steady, unhurried attention he had been giving her since she'd walked in, and she had a sudden, disorienting memory, specific, unbidden, the kind of memory that ambushes you, of sitting across a table from him once before, years ago, in a diner on the north side at 2 a.m, and him watching her with exactly this quality of attention, like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. She had loved that once. She had resented it once. Right now she needed it to be something else, a resource, a tool, an alliance. What are you going to do? She asked. He placed both his palms flat on the table, a mirror of what she had done. I'm going to burn it down, he said. She waited. The organization, all of it, not surrender it to Sartori, dismantle it, through legal channels where possible, through other means where not. Testimony, documentation, assets transferred to accounts that federal investigators can find. I have been in contact with a specific prosecutor for the last 8 months. I have been building the case. He held her eyes. The accident accelerated the timeline. My coming here accelerated the timeline, but the plan was already in motion. And Sartori doesn't know about the prosecutor. They think I'm negotiating. I have been letting them think that. Something cold moved through his voice. Not cruelty, just the specific temperature of someone who has been planning something for a long time. When the documentation drops, it implicates the DeLuca organization. It also implicates the Sartori group, because they have been connected to my organization's operations for 6 of the last 14 years. They don't know I kept those records. They should have made sure I didn't. That was their mistake. When does this happen? I was planning the end of the month. Now, he stopped. His ribs were bothering him. She saw it in the micro-expression around his eyes, the shallow adjustment of his breath. He pushed through it. Now I am going to move it to 72 hours. Match their deadline. Before they can use your mother, before they can use Sophie, the documentation is with the prosecutor, and this is over. Over, she said. The criminal aspect, yes. And the personal aspect. The people in this organization who are going to be affected. Are any of them going to come after you when they understand what you've done? A pause. Some of them might try. Might. Will it, he said. Some of them will try. She sat with the honesty of it. Then, can you stop them? Yes. Are you sure? He looked at her steadily. No, he said, but I'm going to anyway. Chit. She drove to her mother's apartment at 10:15. Sophie was asleep in Patricia's second bedroom, curled around the cat Gerald with the absolute physical commitment of a sleeping child. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her daughter in the dark. The dark hair fanned on the pillow, one hand open, the particular quality of stillness that Sophie never had when awake and had completely when asleep, as if her body used sleep to recover from the exhaustion of being so relentlessly, vigorously alive. She closed the door softly. Patricia was still up. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a book she wasn't reading. She looked up when Claire came in and did not ask how the dinner went. Claire sat down. She put her hands on the table. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Patricia set the book down. She straightened slightly. She had her daughter's quality of stillness when something mattered, the same spine, the same particular readiness. Claire noticed it and didn't have time to feel anything about it. She told her. Not everything. not the inner workings of the Sartori group, not the specifics of Vincent's plan. What she told her was about 1993 and Caruso and the wire transfers and the signature on the intake forms. What she told her was that someone had kept those records and was intending to use them. Patricia listened. Her hands, wrapped around the cold cup, did not move. Her face did the thing it did when she was managing something large and was not going to let it manage her. When Claire finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew what I was signing." The kitchen was very quiet. "Not all of it," Patricia said. "I didn't know. I didn't know the extent of it, but I knew the man was not running a legitimate business. I was 24 and I had you to feed, and the rent was 2 weeks overdue, and he offered me $400 in cash to process the transfers and not ask questions." She looked at her hands. "I have thought about it many times over many years. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself I was protecting you." She looked up. "I told myself a lot of things that were true in a limited way and not true in the ways that matter." Claire said nothing. "Are you angry?" Patricia asked. "Yes," Claire said. "Not at you. I don't know who I'm angry at." That was mostly true. "I'm angry at the architecture of it, that this was always there, that you've been carrying it. I didn't want you to know. I know. I didn't want it to touch you. I know." Claire reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's. "It touched me anyway. That's not your fault. That's just how this works." Patricia looked at her daughter's hand on hers. Something moved across her face. Not tears, not quite, but the pressure that comes before them. She held it back with the particular dignity of a woman who has been holding things back for 30 years. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we wait 72 hours, Claire said. "And we don't go anywhere separately. You and Sophie stay together. You don't answer the door. I'm going to call you every 2 hours, and if I don't call, you call this number." She slid Marco's card across the table. "These are people Vincent trusts. You don't have to trust them, but they'll keep you safe while this resolves." Patricia picked up the card, looked at it. "You trust him?" she said. "Vincent." Claire thought about the letter. Safe is not a distance you can maintain from the outside. She thought about him sitting across the restaurant table with 3 fractured ribs and telling her about a federal prosecutor he'd been building a case with for 8 months, and the specific quality of his voice when he said it, not asking her to be impressed, just telling her the truth. "I trust that he's doing what he said he would do," she said. "I trust that he has more to lose from failing than from succeeding." She paused. "That's not the same as trusting him, but it's enough for 72 hours. Patricia nodded slowly. "And after 72 hours?" "After that," Claire said, "I'm going to introduce him to his daughter." The next morning came hard. Claire had slept 3 hours on her mother's couch, which was not enough but was what existed. She woke at 5 to a text from Marco that said simply, "Movement, north side. He needs to see you." She drove to an address she'd been given, a building in Wicker Park that looked like a logistics company from the outside, and was, apparently, something considerably more organized on the inside. She had never been somewhere like this before. She cataloged it the way she cataloged unfamiliar environments: exits, sight lines, the number of people, and their positions. 4 men she didn't recognize. Marco near the door. Vincent at a table covered in documents and a laptop that had multiple screens open. He looked like he hadn't slept either. The ribs were making themselves known. She could see it in how he was holding himself, the slight forward lean that reduced the pressure on the left side, the way his breath was shallow and deliberate. He should have been in bed. He was not in bed. "The Sartori group moved their timeline," he said without preamble. "They're no longer waiting 72 hours. They want a response by tonight." "Why?" "Because someone told them I was meeting with you last night." His jaw was tight. "Which means I have a problem inside my own organization." The room adjusted around that sentence. Marco's expression did not change, which was its own form of expression. "Who?" Claire asked. "I have a reasonable suspicion." He did not name it. "What matters right now is that Sartori knows I'm stalling. They're going to accelerate the pressure. What that means practically is—" He stopped, looked at her with those direct eyes. They're going to make a demonstration. Something that makes clear they're serious and that my timeline doesn't matter. Something public. Sophie, Claire said, or your mother, or both. His voice was controlled. The control was the most frightening thing about it. I cannot let them get close enough to make that demonstration happen, which means I need to move the documentation to the prosecutor today. Not tomorrow. Today. How long does that take? The transfer itself, 2 hours. Setting up the meeting, getting our people in position, making sure the moment the documentation lands, our people are in place, and the Sartori leadership cannot reach outside the building they're currently in. He looked at the table. 6 hours minimum, probably 8. It's 5:40 in the morning, Claire said. Yes. They want a response by tonight. By 8 p.m., yes. She did the math. 6 to 8 hours of operation in a window of approximately 14. It was possible, tightly possible, with no margin, no room for the ordinary disorder of things going not entirely as planned. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her. Nothing. I need you to stay with Sophie and your mother and eat. What do you need from me? She said again. Not what you need me to stay out of. What can I do? He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through him. She watched it go, some resistance or protectiveness or habit of keeping her separate from this. And then it settled into something else, into the recognition that he had said together and meant it, and this was what together looked like when it was real instead of theoretical. The prosecutor, he said. Her name is Dana Kim. She needs to hear from someone outside my organization that this is legitimate, that I'm not engineering something. She's been cautious. She has every reason to be cautious. And there are 2 things she needs confirmed, that the threat to Sophie is real, and that I'm acting under genuine duress and not trying to use her office to eliminate a competitor. He held her gaze. She'll believe a nurse. She'll believe a mother. She won't believe my lawyer or my people. You want me to talk to a federal prosecutor? I want you to tell her the truth, he said, about the photograph at the school, about what you were told last night, about what's at stake. He leaned forward slightly. His ribs punished him for it. She saw his jaw tighten, and he didn't lean back. I know I'm asking you to walk further into this than you ever agreed to walk. I know that. You're asking me to be part of dismantling a criminal organization, she said. I'm asking you to help protect our daughter, he said. The word sat between them, our, simple and enormous. She had a hospital shift starting at 7. She had a daughter asleep in her mother's apartment with a cat named Gerald. She had a mother who had carried a secret for 30 years and set it down last night on a kitchen table. She had 2.5 hours of sleep and the specific clarity of someone who has moved through fear and come out on the other side into the cold, functional country that exists past it. Call Dana Kim, Claire said. Tell her I'm coming. But the meeting with the prosecutor happened at 7:30 in a federal building downtown where the coffee was bad and the conference room smelled of recycled air and decades of difficult conversations. Dana Kim was 40, precise, with the look of someone who had been doing this long enough to be unsurprisable and still chose to be thorough. She had a yellow legal pad and a pen she kept clicking that Claire decided to ignore. She listened to everything Claire told her without interrupting. The accident. The hospital. The photograph through the school fence. The dinner the previous night, the name Caruso, the 1993 records, the ultimatum, and the deadline. When Claire finished, Dana Kim wrote something on the legal pad and then set the pen down. You understand that what you're telling me is that you have a personal relationship with the subject of this investigation, she said. I understand that, Claire said. I'm also telling you that my daughter was photographed at her school 3 days ago by people who have made explicit threats against her if I don't deliver compliance from a man I hadn't spoken to in 8 years until 4 days ago. She looked at the prosecutor directly. You can weigh my personal relationship against the information I've just given you. That's your job. My job was to come here and tell you what's true. Dana Kim looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked the pen back up. The documentation Mr. DeLuca has agreed to provide. Do you have any independent knowledge of its contents? No. Do you believe it to be legitimate? I believe he has been building toward this for 8 months, and that he has more to lose from lying to you than from telling the truth. She paused. That's not a character reference. It's a calculation. Something shifted in Dana Kim's expression. Not a smile exactly, but a recognition of one pragmatic person by another. "All right," she said. "We'll receive the documentation." "Dad." It arrived at 11 to 14 a.m. Vincent's attorney, Catherine Voss, in her charcoal coat with her leather folder, delivered it in person, and Claire, who had no role in that transaction and no reason to be there, was not there for it. She was back at her mother's apartment by noon, sitting at the kitchen table with Sophie, who was working on a drawing of what she announced was a robot that could also be a horse, and who had asked twice why Mom looked tired and accepted the answer work stuff with the skepticism of a child who knows when she's being managed and is choosing, for now, to allow it. At 2:40 p.m., Marco texted, "Documentation received and confirmed. Phase 2 in motion." At 4:18 p.m., a second text, "Sartori leadership under federal surveillance as of 1 hour ago. Movement restricted. They can't reach outside." At 5:52 p.m., a third text, which was 3 words, "Leak identified. Handled." She didn't ask what handled meant. She filed it in the category of things she had decided in the last 72 hours to understand in a general way without requiring specific detail, because specific detail was sometimes the thing you had to trade for being able to keep moving. At 6:30, Vincent called. She stepped into Patricia's bedroom to take it, sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet. "It's in motion," he said. "The documentation is with Kim's office. The surveillance is in place. The Sartori group is going to understand in the next 2 hours what has happened, and they are not going to be able to do anything about it because every move they could make is accounted for." "And the person inside your organization who told them about our dinner?" A pause. "He's not a problem anymore." "Is he alive?" Another pause. Longer. "Yes," Vincent said. "He's in federal custody, as of an hour ago." She exhaled. She had not been aware she'd been holding something until it released. "What happens to you?" she said. "When this is done, what does your deal with Kim's office look like?" "I provided substantial assistance. The terms include, I'm not going to be able to walk away clean, Claire. I have to be honest about that. There are conditions. Oversight, certain restrictions on business activity. My attorney is negotiating some of the specifics." He paused. "I will not be going to prison. That was the condition I would not compromise on." "Because of Sophie." "Because of Sophie," he said. She sat on the edge of her mother's bed in the quiet bedroom and listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. The fractured ribs were audible in it. The slight care, the control. She thought about him at 5:40 this morning at that table covered in documents, leaning forward despite the pain, refusing to lean back. "You should be resting," she said. "I'll rest when this is done." "You have 3 fractured ribs." "I'm aware." "Vincent?" She paused. There was something she needed to say, and she was working out how to say it without it being more than she had decided to offer right now, without it promising things that needed more than 72 hours to earn. "You did what you said you would do." A silence. Then, quietly, "Not yet." "The hardest part." "The hardest part," he said, "is going to be the conversation with a 7-year-old who stopped asking about her father 6 months ago." She looked at the door. Through it, muffled, Sophie was telling Patricia something about the horse robot, with the escalating insistence of a child whose point is not being sufficiently appreciated. "Let me handle that," Claire said. "When it's time, I'll handle that part." "I know," he said. "I trust you." She sat with those 3 words for a moment, turned them over, set them down carefully in a place that was not yet sure what to do with them. "Get through tonight," she said. "Then we'll talk." She ended the call and sat in the quiet for another minute. Through the door, she could hear Sophie's voice clearly now. Not the words, just the sound of it, bright and assured, the sound of a child who has been unconditionally loved for 7 years and has developed, as a result, a complete confidence in the validity of her own opinions. She had done that. She had built that in her daughter, alone, one day at a time, one packed lunch and one bedtime story and one answered question at a time, and she was not going to let anything touch it. Not the Sartori group, not 30-year-old bank records, not anything. She went back to the kitchen. At 8:14 p.m., 16 minutes past the Sartori deadline, Marco sent a final text. It's done. Kim's office has made contact with Sartori Council. They know. No further movement on your family. Claire read it at the kitchen table while Sophie, Drew, and Patricia pretended to read her book. She set the phone face down. Mom, Sophie said without looking up from the drawing, do you think robots can have feelings? I think it depends on the robot, Claire said. Sophie considered this seriously. I think this one does, she said, pointing to the drawing with her pencil. But it doesn't tell anyone because it doesn't want them to think it's weird. Claire looked at her daughter's bent head, at the dark hair falling forward, at the hand moving the pencil across the paper with the absolute certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're making. I think that's very relatable, she said. Sophie looked up. She had Vincent's eyes and Claire's jaw and a gap in her front teeth that had been growing and crooked for 3 weeks. She had the specific look of a child who is about to ask something she has been working up to. Mom, she said, is the change you talked about? Is it a big change or a small change? Claire looked at her daughter. She thought about a letter that said safe is not a distance you can maintain from the outside. She thought about a purple crayon drawing with a gap where something else might have gone. She thought about a man who had spent 8 years making the wrong decision for what he believed were the right reasons, and had spent the last 4 days dismantling an empire to correct it. It's a big change, she said, but I think it's going to be okay. Sophie looked at her for a moment longer, that direct, assessing look that had always been slightly unnerving in a child so young, like being evaluated by someone who had not yet learned to be polite about it. Okay, Sophie said, and went back to drawing. And outside Patricia's apartment building, in a car Claire could not see from the window, a man with 3 fractured ribs and a deal with a federal prosecutor and 8 years of wrong decisions behind him sat very still in the dark, watching the lit window on the second floor, and waited for whatever came next. The car was still there in the morning. Claire saw it when she looked out Patricia's kitchen window at 6:47 a.m. while the coffee was brewing. A dark sedan parked across the street, engine off, exactly where Marco's text had indicated someone would be watching through the night. She had expected to feel something about that. Surveillance. The presence of men with specific jobs positioned around her mother's building. She had expected it to feel like an intrusion. It felt, instead, like the first morning in 4 days where the air outside was simply air and not a threat dressed up as weather. She poured 2 cups of coffee, carried one to the table, sat down in the particular quiet of a kitchen before the rest of the apartment wakes up. The refrigerator's low hum, the radiator clicking, the distant sound of a city already in motion. She wrapped both hands around the mug and sat with the quiet for as long as it lasted, which was approximately 4 minutes before Sophie appeared in the doorway in her socks, hair catastrophic, holding the cat Gerald with the casual authority of someone who has decided this animal belongs to her regardless of whose apartment they are in. Gerald was on my face, Sophie announced. Gerald does that. It's not a good way to wake up. No, Claire agreed. It isn't. Sophie deposited the cat on the floor and climbed into the chair across from her mother and looked at her with those 2 direct eyes. 7 years old, and she already had the habit of looking at Claire the way Claire looked at patients. Assessing, systematic, not unkind, but not soft either. You look better, Sophie said. I slept. You didn't sleep the other nights. I know. I could tell, Sophie said, with the certainty of a child who tracks these things as a matter of survival. She pulled her knees up to her chest. Gerald jumped onto the chair beside her. Is the big change happening today? Claire looked at her daughter. She had been thinking, since the text from Marco the night before, about how to do this. What to say. In what order, with what words. She had approached it the way she approached difficult conversations at work. Organize, sequence, lead with information before emotion. Make sure the person understands what they're being given and has room to respond. She had prepared approximately nothing that was going to be useful. Yes, she said. It's happening today, but first I need to tell you something. Sophie waited. She was good at waiting when she understood it mattered. Your dad, Claire said. She said those 2 words and then stopped, because they were not words she had said in combination before. Not to Sophie, not aloud, not in this direct way. And the weight of them was different from what she'd expected. Not heavier exactly. More real, like something theoretical becoming physical. He's alive. He's been alive. He didn't leave because he didn't want us. It's more complicated than that, and I'm going to explain all of it when you're older and when I understand more of it myself. But he's here. He's in Chicago, and he wants to know you." Sophie was very still. The refrigerator hummed. Gerald put his head on Sophie's knee. "You said he was gone," Sophie said. Not accusing, factual, cataloging. "I thought he was. I thought he'd chosen to be gone. I was wrong about some of it." Claire held her daughter's eyes. She was not going to look away. Sophie deserved not to have her mother look away. "I'm sorry I didn't have a better answer sooner. I'm sorry you had to go without knowing." Sophie looked at the cat, looked back. "Does he know about me?" she asked. "Like, does he know what I'm like? Or does he just know I exist?" "He knows you exist," Claire said. "He wants to know what you're like. That's different. That's something you would show him, if you wanted to." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Her bottom lip moved slightly, an internal conversation happening that Claire was not going to interrupt. "Is he nice?" Claire thought about a man in a dark coat arriving early to a quiet cafe and leaving all his power in the car. She thought about him sitting across a restaurant table with fractured ribs, telling her the truth without decoration. She thought about him outside this building last night, in the dark, waiting. "He's trying to be," she said. "He hasn't always been, but he's trying." Sophie nodded slowly. That was apparently sufficient information. "Can I meet him?" she said. "That's up to you," Claire said. "Completely up to you." Sophie looked at Gerald, scratched behind his ear. Gerald's eyes closed in the specific expression of a cat accepting tribute. "Today?" Sophie said. "If you want." "Okay," Sophie said, "but I want breakfast first." She texted Vincent at 7:30. 2 words. She knows. His response came back in under a minute. 3 words. "How is she?" Claire looked at her daughter on the other side of the kitchen table, who was eating toast with the focused satisfaction of someone who has made a significant decision and feels good about it and is now moving efficiently through the rest of her morning. She typed back, "She asked if you were nice. She wants to meet you. She wanted breakfast first." A longer pause this time. Then, "Tell me where and when." She chose the cafe on the river, not for any reason she could have articulated precisely, more because it was somewhere she had been before, somewhere she knew the light and the noise level and the table near the window that looked out at the water. Familiar ground. She needed familiar ground for this. She called ahead, reserved the corner table, then she called Marco. "The men watching the building can stand down," she said. "It's over. Mr. DeLuca will want... The Sartori group is under federal surveillance. The deal is done. It's over." She paused. "If he wants security present at a cafe on the river this morning, he can post someone outside. They don't come in. This meeting is private." A beat. "Understood." She told Patricia they'd be back by noon. Patricia looked at her daughter, and then at Sophie, and then back at her daughter and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing she could have said. What? They arrived at the cafe at 9:15. Sophie had insisted on wearing the red sweater, which Claire had no objection to, and had asked 3 questions on the drive over. Whether her dad was tall, whether he liked animals, and whether she had to call him dad, or if she could call him something else at first. Claire had answered, yes, she didn't know, but they could ask, and she could call him whatever felt right. Sophie had thought about the third answer for a while and then said, "Maybe I'll just see what comes out," which was, Claire thought, a more sophisticated approach than most adults would manage. Vincent was there when they walked in. He had done what the outline said he would do. Arrived before them, no visible security, dressed without ostentation, sitting with both hands on the table and a glass of water he hadn't touched. He was looking at the door when they came through it. He saw Sophie first. Claire watched his face do something she had never seen a human face do before. Not quite. The closest she could compare it to, in the language she had, was what happened to a patient's face when they came out of something they hadn't been sure they'd come out of. That specific private quality of relief that hasn't yet caught up with what it's relieved about. But it was more than that. It was a man looking at 7 years he hadn't been present for and seeing them standing in a red sweater in a cafe doorway and understanding, in whatever way the mind truly understands things that are too large for it, that they were real and that he was here and that this was what everything else had cost. Sophie looked at him with her direct, systematic gaze. She turned to Claire. "He is tall," she said, as if confirming a hypothesis. "I told you," Claire said. They walked to the table. Vincent stood as they approached, which Sophie noted with the minor interest of a child who has been taught that this is something adults do in certain situations. He looked at Sophie, and then at Claire, and then at Sophie again. And he did not reach out, did not make any motion toward her, simply stood and waited with the stillness of someone who has understood that there is only one right thing to do here, and it is to let the child lead. Sophie looked up at him. A 7-year-old looking at a 6-foot man who happened to be her father with complete pragmatic assessment. "My mom said you didn't know about me at first," she said. Vincent sat down carefully. His ribs were still. He did not show it in his face. "That's right," he said. "And then you knew, but you didn't come." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" In the silence that followed, Claire watched Vincent DeLuca, who had faced federal prosecutors and rival crime organizations, and the particular violence of a world that ran on fear, face a 7-year-old's question with the visible experience of someone who has not been more frightened of anything in their life. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "A big one. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. I was wrong." He held Sophie's gaze. "There isn't a better answer than that. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sophie absorbed this. She had the face of a child running a complex calculation. "My mom makes mistakes too," she said finally. "She says sorry, and then she does better." "That's the plan," Vincent said. Sophie appeared to find this reasonable. She pulled out the chair and sat down and said, "I have a robot drawing to show you. I left it at Grandma's, but I can describe it." Something happened to Vincent's mouth. It was not a smile exactly. It was the face of a man who has not laughed easily in a long time, discovering that something has made the muscles for it work again. "Tell me about the robot," he said. They stayed at the cafe for an hour and 40 minutes. Claire watched more than she participated. That was deliberate. This was Sophie's meeting, Sophie's hour, and her job right now was to be present without dominating, to be the safety net stretched out below without being visible enough to make the act more difficult. Sophie talked about the robot horse. She talked about Gerald the cat, and the hierarchy of foods she considered worth eating, and a specific injustice that had occurred on the school bus 3 weeks ago that she described with the prosecutorial intensity of someone building a case. She explained, at some length, her theory about why birds were more complicated than people gave them credit for. Vincent listened. He asked questions that demonstrated he'd been paying attention. Following the threads, picking up what mattered to her, asking the next question rather than the obvious one. At one point, Sophie said something that surprised him, and his face did that thing again, the involuntary working of muscles that had learned to stay still, and he had to look at the window for a moment before he looked back. Claire reached across the table at one point to get the sugar for her coffee, and her hand passed near his, and neither of them acknowledged it, and both of them were aware of it. That was where they were. Not fixed, not started. Somewhere in the approach of something that needed more time than 4 days and a criminal dismantling to determine. Near the end, Sophie went to the bathroom, which required navigating to the back of the cafe with the confidence of a child who has decided she knows where things are after being in a place for 40 minutes. And for the first time since they'd sat down, it was just Claire and Vincent at the table. He looked at her. "She's extraordinary," he said. It came out quieter than anything else he'd said that morning, like something he hadn't meant to say aloud and had said anyway, because the alternative was carrying it alone and he had apparently run out of room. "I know," Claire said. "You did that." She helped. He looked at the table, back at her. The late morning light from the river window was doing something specific to the planes of his face, showing the years in it, the marks of them, the tiredness that was not just the last week, but the accumulated weight of a long time doing difficult things. He looked like someone who had put something down recently and hadn't yet adjusted to his own weight without it. "The prosecutor's office is going to want a debriefing session next week," he said. "I'll be in that process it'll take months, Catherine is managing the specifics. He paused. There are going to be consequences that I can't entirely predict yet. Some of the people I'm testifying against, their attorneys are going to work to discredit me. It's going to be in the news, parts of it. He held her gaze. Sophie is going to hear things about who I was. I know. I can't protect her from that. No, Claire said. You can't. She looked toward the back of the cafe where Sophie had disappeared. But you can be there when she hears it. That's different from not being there. That's entirely different. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to be able to do this? He said. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I know what I've asked of you in the last 4 days. I know it's not a small thing. He turned his water glass slowly on the table. I just need to know, are you still willing to see where this goes? After everything. Claire looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd walked into Trauma Bay 4 and told herself the most important thing was to not let him see how much she recognized him. She thought about the supply room on the 3rd floor, where she'd stood between the shelving units and intervened on herself. She thought about a letter that had no apology in it, only facts, and how that had been the most honest thing anyone had offered her in years. She thought about Patricia's kitchen and 30-year-old wire transfers and the particular loneliness of a secret carried too long. She thought about Sophie at the kitchen table saying, maybe I'll just see what comes out. I'm willing to see where it goes, she said. That's not a promise. That's not forgiveness. That's me telling you that I'm not closing the door. He nodded. That was all. He didn't push it, didn't try to make it more than it was, didn't reach across the space between them to claim something that hadn't been offered. He just received what she'd given him and held it carefully, the way you hold something that might break, and left room for it to be what it was. Sophie came back from the bathroom. There's a drawing on the wall in the bathroom, she announced, sitting back down. It's not very good. The proportions are wrong. Whose proportions? Vincent asked. The horse in the drawing. Horse's legs are longer than that. You're right, Vincent said. They are. Sophie looked at him with the particular expression of a child who has just discovered that an adult agrees with her on something she expected to have to argue. Do you know about horses? Some, he said. Not as much as you, probably. I don't know that much, Sophie said honestly. I've only read 2 books about them, but in the books, the legs are definitely longer. 2 books is a solid foundation, Vincent said. Sophie considered this and apparently agreed because she moved on to the next subject. The river outside the window, whether fish could be seen from the cafe if you looked hard enough, and whether that would be a good or bad thing for the fish in question. The conversation about horses and fish and river visibility lasted 12 minutes, and Claire sat in it and let it happen around her and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something with this many complicated layers. More like the sensation of a wound that has been managed for so long that the managing has become the baseline. And then something shifts, and you realize the managing is no longer the whole of what's happening. That underneath the management, something has been, slowly and without announcing itself, beginning to close. So, they walked out of the cafe at 11:07. The March air had changed overnight. Less hostile, still cold, but with a quality that suggested it was considering its options. The river was the color of pewter under a pale sky. Sophie walked slightly ahead of them on the riverwalk, looking at the water with the focused interest of someone who has not yet ruled out the fish. Vincent walked beside Claire. Not close. The distance between them was exactly the distance between 2 people who are not yet sure of the geometry of the thing they're building. The building on North Dearborn, Vincent said, not looking at her. The property I own there. I've been using it as one of the locations involved in the case. It's going to be transferred to the federal asset pool. There are 3 others. He paused. My attorney is separating out the properties that were acquired through legitimate means. There are more than people would expect. What are you going to do? Claire said. After the process is done. What does a day look like for you? He thought about this. She could see him thinking about it, the specific blankness of someone trying to imagine a future they haven't been permitted to imagine. I have some legitimate real estate interests that weren't part of the organization. I know how to run operations. the managing of people and resources and contingencies. He glanced at her sideways. Apparently that skill set is applicable to legal enterprises as well as illegal ones, I've been told. By your attorney. By Catherine, yes. She believes in the possibility of this more than I do, most days. That's what good attorneys do. Probably. He watched Sophie crouch suddenly by the railing to peer at something in the water. I'm going to need to figure out who I am when I'm not. This, he said. Quiet. Not asking for her help with that, just saying it out loud, which was its own kind of new thing. So does everyone, Claire said. At some point, most people just do it at a more ordinary scale. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Sophie straightened and turned back to them. There aren't any fish visible, she reported, but I think they're there. They're just choosing not to be seen. Smart fish, Claire said. Sophie looked at Vincent. Do you want to come to the aquarium sometime? She said. They have fish you can see, and also sharks. She paused, with the social awareness of someone who has only just remembered something. Are we doing that? Doing things? The question was simple and enormous simultaneously. The question of a child who has been given a large piece of information and is trying to understand its practical implications. Vincent crouched down, slowly, because of his ribs, though he didn't make a production of it, so that he was closer to her level. He looked at Sophie with the specific quality of attention he'd been giving her all morning, full. Nothing held back from it. I'd like to do things if you want to, he said. But you set the pace. You understand what I mean by that? Like I decide how fast, Sophie said. Exactly like that. Sophie thought about it. A gust came off the river, moving her dark hair across her face. She pushed it back with the impatience of a child who has not yet decided whether to grow it out or cut it. The aquarium has a Friday night thing, she said, with the jellyfish. They do lights. She looked at Claire. Can we do that? We can do that, Claire said. Sophie looked back at Vincent. Do you like jellyfish? I don't have strong feelings about jellyfish, Vincent said honestly. That's okay, Sophie said. You don't have to like them. You just have to be willing to look at them for a while. Vincent held her gaze. Something moved through his face. Deep, unhurried, the seismic, slow movement of something settling into a new position after a long time of being held wrong. I can do that, he said. Sophie nodded, satisfied. Then she stood and turned back to the river, as if the matter were settled, as if the question of a relationship with her father had been reasonably resolved by a mutual agreement about jellyfish, and perhaps it had, in the way that the largest things sometimes resolve, not in a dramatic moment, but in an ordinary one, in the agreeing to show up and look at something together. The weeks that followed were not easy. That needed to be said plainly because nothing in the preceding days had suggested they would be. And the truth was that the aftermath of a storm is still wet, even when the storm is done. The federal proceedings moved at the speed of federal proceedings, which was not fast. Catherine Voss spent considerable hours on the phone in positions that were not physically comfortable. Dana Kim's office was thorough and methodical, and asked questions that required Vincent to sit in rooms across from people who were specifically trained not to be impressed by anything and answer them honestly. He did this. It cost him in ways that were visible and ways that were not. 3 of the people he testified against had attorneys who attempted, in various creative ways, to paint him as the architecture of every harm anyone connected to his organization had ever done. They were not entirely wrong. He did not dispute the factual elements. He disputed the framing where he could and accepted the rest. There was a news story in the Tribune in the second week. It named him. It was accurate in its facts and incomplete in its understanding, as news stories tend to be. Claire's name was not in it, which was something Catherine had worked specifically to arrange and which cost something to arrange that Catherine had declined to specify. Sophie saw the story on a tablet someone left open at Patricia's apartment. She was 9 months away from 8 years old, and she had learned to read adult material with the thoroughness of a child who understands that the things the adults in her life consider significant are worth paying attention to. She read it, and then she put the tablet down and went to find Claire. It says he did bad things, Sophie said. Claire was in the kitchen. She set down what she was holding, turned around, and gave Sophie her full attention. "Yes," she said, "he did. And now he's telling the people in charge about it? He's cooperating with an investigation. Yes. Is he going to get in trouble? Some trouble. Yes." Sophie looked at the floor, then up. "Does he feel bad about it?" "I think he's felt bad about a lot of it for a long time," Claire said. "And I think he's trying to do something about that feeling instead of just having it." Sophie worked this through. The bottom lip again. The internal conversation. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay?" "I mean, it's bad," Sophie said, with the precision of a child who understands moral categories and is not interested in pretending otherwise. "But okay means I'm still going to the aquarium." She looked at Claire directly. "Is that allowed? That I know it's bad and I still want to go?" Claire crouched down to Sophie's level. She put her hands on her daughter's arms. She looked at her seriously because Sophie was serious and deserved seriousness back. "Yeah," she said. "That's allowed. That's a very mature thing to understand. That someone can do bad things and also be worth knowing. Those aren't contradictions. They're just, people are complicated." "Like the robot who has feelings but doesn't tell anyone," Sophie said. "Exactly like that," Claire said. Sophie hugged her then. Sudden, brief, with the force of a child who means it, and then pulled back and said she was hungry and went to look in the refrigerator, and the moment was done, filed away in the place where Sophie filed significant moments, which was apparently somewhere very well organized. The aquarium visit happened on the third Friday of March. Claire had told Vincent about the Tribune story before Sophie saw it, because she believed in not managing information and because he deserved to know when something connected to him had touched his daughter. He had listened and said nothing for a long moment, and then asked if Sophie was all right. Claire had said she was. He had said he would understand if Claire wanted to cancel the aquarium. She had not canceled the aquarium. She was not going to manage his access to Sophie based on the presence of difficult information. She was going to manage it based on Sophie's well-being, and Sophie's well-being currently required jellyfish and Friday night lights, and so they were going to the aquarium. They met him at the entrance at 6:30. Sophie was wearing the red sweater again. She had decided, apparently, that this was her meeting Vincent sweater, and Claire was not going to argue with that. Vincent was at the entrance with 2 tickets already purchased, which Sophie clocked immediately. "You already bought tickets," she said. "I did." "How did you know the right number to buy?" 3 people, he said. "Your mom, you, and me." Sophie considered the arithmetic. "What if Grandma came?" "Then I would buy another ticket," he said, without missing a beat. Sophie appeared to find this a satisfactory answer. "Okay," she said, and walked in. The jellyfish were in a darkened room toward the back of the building, lit from below and above in shifting blues and purples that made the space feel like being inside something luminous. Sophie pressed close to the glass and watched them with the focused intensity she brought to things she had decided mattered. Moon jellies, lion's mane, one enormous Pacific sea nettle the color of rust and fire, its tentacles trailing behind it like something from a dream. Vincent stood next to her, not close, the distance of a man who understood that proximity was something to be earned in increments. "They don't have brains," Sophie said, not looking away from the glass. "I've heard that," Vincent said. "But they still move. They still go somewhere." She watched a moon jelly pulse its way upward through the blue-lit water. "My teacher says they just respond to the current, but I think it looks more intentional than that." "Maybe it is," Vincent said. "Maybe we don't know everything about what it's like to be a jellyfish." Sophie turned and looked at him, that evaluating look. "You actually think about stuff," she said. It was not entirely a compliment, and not entirely not one. More an observation, the way a scientist notes an unexpected variable. "Sometimes," he said, "my mom thinks about stuff too." Sophie looked back at the jellyfish. "She thinks about everything all the time. You can tell because she goes quiet." "I've noticed that," Vincent said. "Is that why you liked her?" Sophie said, with the complete casualness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions have weight. "Because she thinks?" A pause. Claire, standing a half step back, did not move. Among other reasons, Vincent said. What other reasons? She doesn't back down from things, he said, even when it would be easier. He glanced at Claire briefly. She walked into things this week that most people would have walked away from. Sophie turned and looked at Claire with an expression Claire recognized, the periodic blunt assessment that landed like a compliment when it came from Sophie, because it was never performed. She does do that, Sophie agreed, then turned back to the jellyfish. They stayed in the jellyfish room for 22 minutes. Claire counted the minutes in the way she counted things at work. Not anxiously, just keeping track. 22 minutes of the three of them in the blue light, watching creatures without brains move through water with what looked, no matter what the biology said, like intention. When they left the room, Sophie reached up and took Vincent's hand. She didn't announce it. She didn't look at him when she did it. She was looking at the next exhibit, sharks, which she was very interested in. And she reached up and put her hand in his the way she sometimes did with Claire, when she was interested in something else and still wanted to know someone was there. Vincent looked at Claire over Sophie's head. Claire looked back. There was nothing to say about it that wouldn't have reduced it. They said nothing. The spring arrived eventually, the way springs arrive in Chicago, Seb. Not gradually, not all at once, but in arguments. Some days warm and bright, and then a hard frost returning like someone who forgot something and came back for it. Until finally the warmth won and stayed, and the city emerged from itself with the particular relief of people who have survived another winter and don't take it for granted. The legal process did not end in spring. It was going to continue well into summer, Catherine said, and possibly into the following year for some of the peripheral proceedings. This was the cost of dismantling something large. The actual dismantling was the short part. The accounting was long. Vincent moved out of the building in Wicker Park that had served as his operational center and into an apartment on the north side that was notable for being ordinary. He had done this deliberately and had told Claire about it deliberately. Not performance, information. This is where I live now. This is what it looks like. She had not visited the apartment. That was not yet where they were. Where they were was this. Friday evening sometimes. A cafe on the river when Sophie wanted the window table. The aquarium twice more. A park on a Sunday in April when the weather finally decided to cooperate, and Sophie wanted to feed bread to ducks, and Claire had packed too much food, as she usually did, and they had ended up spreading it out on a blanket and eating most of it themselves while the ducks looked on with professional disappointment. Vincent had sat on the blanket and not known entirely what to do with himself. She could see it in him. The man who had managed operations and controlled outcomes existing inside an afternoon that had no agenda, and the small, private work of learning to be someone for whom an afternoon with no agenda was not a problem to be solved, but a thing to be in. Sophie had handed him a piece of bread for the ducks, and he had thrown it wrong, and she had corrected his technique with the seriousness of an expert in a new field. And he had tried again, and she had said better in the tone of a junior professor recognizing marginal improvement. Claire had watched all of this from behind a sandwich she hadn't been eating. Patricia had come with them that day. She and Vincent had met for the first time the week before, in Claire's apartment, over a dinner that had the particular loaded quality of a meeting between two people who share a complicated history with the same person and are deciding how to exist in the same space. Patricia had been direct and not unfriendly, which was the best Claire had hoped for. Vincent had been direct and not defensive, which surprised her. At one point, Patricia had said, without looking up from the salad she was serving, "You hurt my daughter for 8 years." Vincent had said, "Yes." Patricia had said, "Are you going to hurt her again?" Vincent had said, "I'm going to try very hard not to." Patricia had said, "That's not the same thing." "No," he'd said, "it isn't. I know that." Patricia had looked at him then, a long, assessing look. The mother of a woman who had managed alone, the woman who had carried her own 30-year secret and understood the weight of choices made in difficult moments. "Okay," she'd said, and passed him the salad. There was a conversation Claire had been carrying since the restaurant in March, since the night he'd told her about the prosecutor, about the timeline, about what he intended to dismantle. She had carried it the way she carried things she wasn't ready to have yet, kept it in movement, kept her hands busy with other things, checked in on it periodically, and assessed whether it was ready to be set down. It was ready in May. They were on the river walk again. Not the cafe, just walking. Sophie was at a friend's birthday party, and Claire had found herself with 3 hours that were entirely her own and had used the first of them to text Vincent. "Free this afternoon, river walk if you're not busy." He had been there in 40 minutes. They walked without particular destination. The river was different in May, less pewter, more green. The city reflected in it with more warmth than it had in March. Claire walked with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes on the path ahead and let the silence exist for a while, because she had learned, in the months since the hospital, that silence between them was not the same as the silence of those 8 years. It was a different quality. It was two people who had decided to be in proximity and were comfortable with what that required. "I need to say something," she said eventually. "All right." She kept walking. It was easier that way. "I'm angry," she said. "I want you to know that I'm still angry. Not like I was in March. That was the raw version. This is something that's going to be there for a while. The years I raised her alone that you knew about and didn't help with. The 4 questions she asked that you could have answered." She paused. "I need you to know I'm carrying that, and I'm not pretending not to." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to hold it over you forever," she said. I'm not interested in doing that. But I need you to not expect it to be gone." She glanced at him sideways. "Can you live with that?" "Yes," he said. "Because some days I'm going to look at you and it's going to be there," she said. "Not every day, but some days. And I need it to be okay to have that without it. Meaning the whole thing falls apart." "It won't fall apart," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "You've said that before," she said. "Not cruelty. Fact." "I know." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned to look at her directly, the way he had been doing since the hospital, that unguarded directness that she had decided to believe was not performance because she was too tired to keep deciding it might be. "I'm not going anywhere," he said again. "Not because I've said it. Because I have a 7-year-old daughter who just taught me the correct technique for throwing bread to ducks, and who has decided, based on criteria I don't fully understand, that I'm worth showing up for. I'm not going to be the reason she learns to stop trusting that decision." Claire looked at him. The river moved behind him. Someone on a bicycle passed on the path. "She has your eyes," Claire said. "She has your jaw," he said. "She has her own everything else," Claire said. "She's her own thing entirely." "I know," he said, and said it in the way of someone who has been present for the proof of that and is still quietly astonished by it. Claire looked at the river, back at him. "I'm not saying I forgive you," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not for a while. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying—" She stopped, found the right shape for it. "I'm saying that the door is open, that I'm willing to see what this is when it's not a crisis, when it's just Tuesday, when it's ordinary." He looked at her with something that was too large and too specific to be named, and was held back by the same quality she'd seen in him since the restaurant. Not taking, waiting. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." She nodded once. They stood on the river walk in the May afternoon, two people who had been through something enormous and come out the other side into something unresolved and honest and real, and the distance between them was still the distance of two people who are not yet sure of the geometry of the thing they're building, but it was less than it had been, and they were both aware of that without needing to name it. "Sophie wants to do the aquarium again," Claire said, and started walking. "Friday?" he said, falling into step beside her. "Friday works." Met. In June, Sophie lost the second front tooth while eating an apple at Patricia's kitchen table. She documented this event with the thoroughness of a scientist, holding the tooth up to the light, measuring it with a ruler she found in the kitchen drawer, announcing it was 1.2 centimeters and that she expected to find this interesting. She called Vincent about it. She had his number in her phone. This had happened in April, silently, Sophie having apparently decided that this was a thing that should exist, and texted him a picture of Gerald looking unimpressed with something. He had texted back a photograph of a pigeon on his apartment windowsill, looking equally unimpressed, and she had declared this an appropriate response. and they had been texting periodically since then. She called him now about the tooth and held the phone on speaker, and he listened to the full 1.2 centimeter report and said it was an extremely thorough assessment, and she said she knew that. And Claire stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her daughter talk to her father about the measurement of a tooth with the ease of something that had been happening for years, and felt the particular weight of a thing that had been held a long time being set down. Not gone. Still there, in the way that things that happen to you are always there. The 8 years, the 4 questions, the purple crayon drawing with the gap. All of it was still there and was going to stay there. Part of the architecture of what had been built and what had been lost and what was slowly being made into something new. But there was room beside it now for this. For a 7-year-old reporting tooth measurements into a phone. For Friday evenings with a window table. For a man sitting on a blanket in a park, learning the correct technique for feeding ducks. For an apartment on the north side that was ordinary in a way that had been chosen deliberately. For the open door. For whatever ordinary Tuesday looked like when it finally arrived. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, deeply, completely, with Gerald on her feet and one hand open, Claire sat on her couch in her own apartment with the lights low and looked at the purple drawing on the wall. Sophie had added to it recently. Claire had noticed but hadn't said anything, and Sophie hadn't said anything, in the way they sometimes both notice things and let them exist without commentary. In the gap in the drawing, the space where something else might have gone, there was now a figure, small, drawn in purple like the rest, slightly less certain in its lines than the other two, like Sophie had added it more carefully, with more attention, making sure it stayed inside the lines she'd already made. 3 figures now. Claire looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she turned off the light and went to bed and slept through the night without waking once.